On a late summer day in 1944, specifically the 19th of August, deep within the heavily fortified compound known as Wehrmacht headquarters in East Prussia, a senior German officer named General Oberst Alfred Jodl sat reviewing the most recent intelligence assessments that had arrived from the deteriorating situation along the Western Front. The staff officers working under Jodl had engaged in meticulous mathematical analysis of the Allied supply chain, which now stretched an extraordinary distance exceeding 400 miles from those initial landing beaches in Normandy all the way to where General Patton's Third Army was spearheading the Allied advance. The conclusion seemed inescapable to these experienced German military minds. The American forces had pushed forward at such a remarkable pace that they had fundamentally outstripped their own logistical capabilities. Within a matter of days, perhaps even mere hours, Patton's momentum would grind to an inevitable halt. No military force in history, regardless of its strength or determination, could possibly sustain such rapid advancement without adequate fuel supplies. This was simply a physical impossibility. Working from his position at the Wolfschanze headquarters, where Hitler himself directed the German war effort, Jodl conducted an analysis based on decades of accumulated military experience and knowledge that every competent German general possessed through hard-won battlefield lessons. An armoured division engaged in active offensive operations consumed approximately 150,000 gallons of fuel every single day. The American forces now found themselves positioned 400 miles distant from their primary supply depots. The mathematical reality appeared absolutely unavoidable. Patton's Third Army would inevitably come to a complete standstill, providing the Wehrmacht with desperately needed time to regroup their forces along the Seine River, potentially establishing defensive positions that could hold until winter weather arrived to slow Allied operations further. What Jodl and his staff could not possibly know, what lay entirely outside their awareness and comprehension, was that 125 miles away from where they conducted their confident analysis, nearly 6,000 trucks were already rolling relentlessly eastward in what appeared to be an endless convoy. These vehicles operated with their headlights blazing brilliantly in direct defiance of standard military doctrine regarding nighttime operations. This massive motorized column was transporting 12,500 tons of supplies every 24 hours without pause. The operation that would come to be known as the Red Ball Express represented a logistics achievement so audacious, so unprecedented in scope and execution, that German military science had never even conceived such an endeavour might be possible. Within 72 hours of Jodl's confident assessment, Patton's supposedly immobilized tanks would crash through German defensive positions at the Seine. Within 1 week, these same armoured forces would participate in the liberation of Paris. Within a single month, American troops would be standing at the German border itself. The finest military minds that the Wehrmacht possessed were about to receive a comprehensive education in American logistics that would fundamentally redefine their understanding of how modern warfare could be conducted. This lesson would be delivered by 23,000 truck drivers, approximately 75% of whom were African American soldiers, who collectively transformed what was essentially a one-way highway system into the most efficient military supply line that history had ever witnessed. The German General Staff's absolute confidence in American logistical failure stemmed from multiple decades of accumulated military experience combined with recent battlefield observations. The Wehrmacht had pioneered the concept of blitzkrieg warfare, had revolutionized combined arms tactical operations, and possessed an intimate understanding of what military theorists referred to as the tyranny of supply lines. German forces had repeatedly experienced situations where their own campaigns stalled not because of enemy resistance, but simply due to the fundamental inability to supply forward forces across vast distances. During operations in Russia, the Wehrmacht's advance had founded initially not from Soviet military resistance, but from the straightforward inability to maintain supply lines across the enormous distances of the Eastern Front. German trucks broke down with alarming frequency on the poorly maintained Russian roads. Horse-drawn wagons, which still comprised approximately 80% of German military transport capacity, could not possibly match the operational pace of panzer spearheads racing ahead. The differences in railway gauge measurements meant that supplies accumulated hundreds of miles behind the advancing front lines, essentially useless to the troops who desperately needed them. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich von Lüttwitz, who would assume command of the 47th Panzer Corps beginning in September of 1944, had written in July of that year that the Americans now faced precisely the same logistical impossibility that German forces had confronted in Russia. Their mechanical advantage inevitably becomes a disadvantage under these conditions. Machines require constant supplies of fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts. The American forces had advanced 400 miles in just 30 days. History teaches us with absolute certainty what must come next, which is complete paralysis of offensive operations. German intelligence services meticulously tracked American consumption rates with characteristic thoroughness. A single Sherman tank burned fuel at the rate of half a mile per gallon when travelling on roads, with significantly worse performance when operating cross-country. An infantry division in active operations required 700 tons of supplies delivered daily. An armoured division needed 1,000 tons per day. Patton commanded 12 divisions advancing along a 60-mile front. The mathematics appeared absolutely irrefutable to German analysts. 12,000 tons required daily, transported 400 miles from the beaches, over roads that had sustained significant damage, through a transportation network that German forces had systematically destroyed during their withdrawal. General Major Siegfried Westphal, who would become Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt in September, completed his calculations on August 24th and concluded that even if the Americans possessed unlimited numbers of trucks, which they clearly did not, and even if they had access to perfect road conditions, which was demonstrably false, and even assuming no mechanical failures whatsoever, which was physically impossible, they still could not sustain Patton's advance for more than another 48 hours at most. Physical laws simply cannot be violated, not even by American industrial capacity. At 2 in the afternoon on August 25, 1944, in a requisitioned French chateau located near the town of Laissay, Lieutenant Colonel Lorraine A. Ayres of the Motor Transport Service faced a room filled with skeptical officers who doubted what they were about to hear. The mathematical realities they presented were stark and unforgiving. Patton's Third Army was consuming supplies at a rate faster than any military force in recorded history, advancing at speeds that defied all existing logistical planning and doctrine. Traditional supply methods, including railway transport, scheduled convoys, and depot-to-depot distribution systems, had completely collapsed under the unprecedented strain. Ayres made his announcement to the assembled officers. They were going to create a dedicated one-way highway running from Cherbourg and the landing beaches directly to the front lines. Every vehicle would operate 20 hours out of every 24-hour period. No stopping would be permitted except for refueling and emergency situations. They would move a minimum of 12,500 tons of supplies daily. The name for this operation came from railway terminology, where a Red Bull freight designation indicated an express shipment that took absolute priority over everything else on the rail network. The Red Bull Express would operate on precisely the same principle, with absolute priority granted to these convoys and no delays or exceptions permitted under any circumstances. The technical specifications for this operation defied every principle of German military doctrine that had been developed over decades. 2 parallel highways would operate as one-way routes, one dedicated to loaded trucks moving forward toward the front, the other reserved for empty vehicles returning to be reloaded. Operations would continue 24 hours daily with headlights blazing, completely abandoning the blackout discipline that military forces had observed since the war began. A strict no-stop policy would be enforced except for refueling and mechanical failures. 5-minute intervals would be maintained between convoys, with vehicles sustaining an average speed of 35 miles per hour. Mobile maintenance units would be positioned every 50 miles along the routes. Military police checkpoints would remove any vehicle travelling below 25 miles per hour from the convoy. Colonel Charles O., Thrasher, who commanded the advanced section of the communication zone known as ADSEC, reviewed the projected numbers with growing concern. They would need 140 truck companies comprising 5,958 vehicles operating at a 90% availability rate. That level of performance was impossible according to any logistics textbook ever written. Yet within just 36 hours, the impossible had become operational reality. On August 26, 1944, drivers from the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC-CK 2.5-ton trucks, vehicles that soldiers affectionately nicknamed the Deuce and a Half, loaded with 105mm artillery shells destined for Patton's guns at a location 300 miles to the east. The demographic composition of the drivers who would operate the Red Ball Express would have absolutely stunned German racial theorists whose ideology undergirded the Nazi regime. Of the 23,000 drivers who would eventually participate in operating this route, approximately 75% were African American soldiers serving in what remained a thoroughly segregated United States Army. These men, who could not eat in restaurants designated for white patrons or use facilities reserved for whites in much of America, were now responsible for keeping the most celebrated white general's army in continuous motion. The drivers developed their own distinctive culture within hours of beginning operations. They painted slogans on their trucks with messages like Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler Here We Come, and Detroit to Berlin Express. They created their own informal traffic regulations. Slower vehicles were required to pull off the road immediately. Vehicles suffering mechanical failures were simply pushed into roadside ditches. Any truck traveling below 20 miles per hour was considered a roadblock to be removed by any means necessary. By August 28th, German reconnaissance units began reporting something entirely unprecedented in their military experience. Units from Aufklärungsabteilung 116 transmitted radio reports from observation positions overlooking the main Red Ball route, describing a continuous vehicle column with headlights visible for 20 kilometers. They estimated 1,000 vehicles per hour passing their position. The Americans maintained virtually no spacing between vehicles. Operating with headlights illuminated at night invited air attack. Continuous columns of vehicles presented perfect targets for artillery. Maintaining no spacing between vehicles meant that a single disabled truck could halt an entire convoy. Yet the Americans appeared completely unconcerned with these vulnerabilities. The German observation post near Chartres filed their report on August 30th. The report to Army Group B headquarters reflected their growing alarm at what they were witnessing. The enemy operates a supply system that lies beyond our comprehension. Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals throughout day and night without any pause. They do not hide their movements, do not disperse their forces, and do not follow any operational rules we understand. This is not military science as we know it. This represents mass production principles applied directly to warfare. What the German observers could not understand was that American logistics operated on fundamentally different principles from European military tradition. Where German doctrine emphasized concealment of movements and forces, Americans relied on overwhelming volume. Where Germans carefully conserved their vehicles and equipment, Americans assumed a 20% mechanical failure rate and planned their operations accordingly. Where Germans followed strict military procedures established through decades of tradition, Americans improvised continuously and adapted in real time to changing conditions. The numerical achievements of the Red Ball Express during its first week of operations defied every German calculation of what was logistically possible for any military force to achieve. From August 25th through August 31st, 1944, the operation delivered 89,939 tons of supplies, representing a daily average of 12,848 tons. The round-trip distance covered was 686 miles. Vehicle rotations involved 5,958 trucks, making an average of 1.5 trips daily. The fuel consumed by the operation itself, just to move the trucks, totaled 300,000 gallons per day. German logistics specialists who captured these figures from American documents initially dismissed them as propaganda, as the numbers seemed impossibly high. But the numbers were absolutely real, and more concerning for German planners, the operation was accelerating rather than slowing down. By September 5th, the Red Ball Express had established an operational rhythm that seemed impossible to German logistics officers, who still relied on horse-drawn wagons for 80% of their own transport needs. Convoys departed at 5-minute intervals from the western terminus of the route. The average convoy consisted of 67 vehicles. Each vehicle carried a standard load of 5 tons, though frequent overloading pushed this to 7 tons. The time required to cover 350 miles in one direction averaged 14 hours. Turnaround time at each end of the route was kept to 2 hours. At any given moment, 5,000 vehicles were in constant motion somewhere along the route. The Red Ball Express generated innovations on an hourly basis as drivers and mechanics solved problems that German military science considered fundamentally insurmountable. When trucks broke down, which happened to approximately 1,800 vehicles daily, mobile maintenance units performed repairs directly on the roadside rather than towing vehicles to rear area depots. Mechanics developed an efficient triage system for evaluating damaged vehicles. If a repair could be completed in 15 minutes or less, they fixed it on the spot. If the repair would require more time, they pushed the vehicle off the road and flagged it for later recovery. When bridges were destroyed, engineers built temporary bypasses using rubble from bombed buildings as roadbed material. The Germans, observing this chaos that somehow produced order and efficiency, simply could not comprehend how it functioned. German logistics doctrine emphasized careful advance planning, strict adherence to maintenance schedules, and proper procedures followed precisely. The Americans violated every established principle, yet their system accelerated its performance rather than collapsing into chaos. The most stunning revelation for German observers concerned American fuel management practices. The Red Ball Express consumed 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily just for its own operations, transporting fuel and supplies. This exceeded the total fuel allocation many German armies received for all purposes combined. Yet fuel supplies never ran short for American operations. The Americans had created a parallel engineering marvel known as Operation Pluto, which stood for pipelines under the ocean, and were actually laying fuel pipelines across the English Channel. By September of 1944, fuel flowed continuously through underwater pipes that German intelligence services had not even detected existed. Forward fuel dumps were established every 25 miles along the Red Ball route. Tanker trucks operated their own parallel convoy system, ensuring that no vehicle waited more than 10 minutes for refueling operations. General Major Walter Vollemont observed operations from aerial reconnaissance photographs that documented the scale of American fuel reserves. The Americans maintain fuel dumps larger than our entire strategic reserves for the whole Wehrmacht. They burn more gasoline simply moving gasoline around than we allocate to entire panzer divisions for combat operations. This is not war as we understand and have studied it. This represents industrial overflow on a scale we never imagined possible. The Red Ball Express did not merely supply Patton's advance, it multiplied the speed of that advance exponentially beyond what German doctrine considered possible. German military planning calculated that an armoured division could sustain an advance of 20 to 30 miles daily under optimal conditions with perfect logistics. Patton's divisions, supplied continuously by the Red Ball Express, averaged 40 to 60 miles of advance daily for weeks on end. On September 1, 1944, the 4th Armoured Division advanced 35 miles during morning operations, then halted at noon for resupply. Red Ball trucks were already waiting with fuel and ammunition, and the division advanced another 32 miles during afternoon operations. This 67-mile single-day advance completely shattered German defensive planning, which was based on assumptions of maximum 30-mile daily advances by enemy armoured forces. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, reviewing these reports from his position in East Prussia, initially refused to believe what the intelligence indicated. No armoured force can possibly advance 60 miles daily for an entire week. Mechanical failures alone would prevent such sustained operations. This must be propaganda or misidentification of units, but intercepted American radio traffic confirmed every detail. Even more disturbing for German commanders, the Americans were broadcasting their positions openly and in the clear without using codes, displaying supreme confidence in their ability to move faster than German forces could possibly react to the intelligence. By September 5, 1944, German intelligence services had compiled comprehensive reports analyzing the Red Ball Express operations. The implications were absolutely catastrophic for Wehrmacht planning assumptions. Every foundational assumption about American military capability required complete revision. The report contained observations that defied every principle of German military science developed over decades. Americans wasted vehicles prodigiously, abandoning damaged trucks rather than investing time and effort in repairing them. Drivers operated on stimulants, including Benzedrine, for days at a time, violating every principle of sound personnel management. The operation maintained no camouflage discipline whatsoever, making the entire system theoretically vulnerable to air attack that never materialized. Mechanical failure rates reached 30% daily, but were simply overwhelmed through massive redundancy. Fuel consumption levels would bankrupt any European military operating under normal constraints. Field Marshal Walter Model's response to these intelligence reports revealed the growing desperation among German commanders. If these reports are accurate in their assessments, we face not merely a superior army in the field, but a fundamentally superior civilization with unlimited resources. They make no effort whatsoever to hide their operations, because they genuinely do not fear us. They waste resources with abandon, because they possess what appear to be infinite resources. We cannot hope to defeat this enemy through superior military tactics alone. The Red Ball Express drivers paid a severe physical price that German observers from a distance could not see or document. Individual drivers operated for 72 straight hours, hallucinating from exhaustion and the effects of Benzedrine tablets distributed to keep them awake. Accidents killed 300 drivers during the Red Bull's operational period. Trucks collided in thick fog, overturned on roads damaged by combat, and burned when overheated engines ignited fuel or cargo. Yet morale among the drivers remained extraordinarily high throughout the operation. These men, mostly African Americans who were denied equal rights and opportunities at home in America, understood clearly that they were making history through their efforts. They were proving Hitler's racial theories wrong with every single mile they drove, with every ton of supplies they delivered to the front lines. Captured German officers provided eloquent testimony to the devastating impact of the Red Ball Express on Wehrmacht operations and morale. Oberst Hans von Luck, taken prisoner in September of 1944, told his interrogators candidly that German forces knew they had lost the war when they finally understood the American supply system. You violate every established rule of military logistics, waste fuel without concern, abandon vehicles casually, exhaust your drivers beyond reasonable limits, yet succeed through sheer overwhelming volume. You have industrialized warfare in ways that lie beyond our comprehension or ability to counter. The psychological impact on German forces in the field was utterly devastating to combat effectiveness. Wehrmacht soldiers could hear American trucks running continuously throughout every night. Endless motors, endless supplies arriving for enemy forces. German troops were rationing their last 3 rounds per rifle, while Americans had millions of rounds being delivered continuously. The sound itself became a form of psychological warfare that undermined German morale. The vehicles themselves amazed German engineers who examined captured or abandoned examples. The GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck that formed the backbone of the Red Ball Express represented mass production perfection that German industry could not match. General Motors had produced over 500,000 of these vehicles by war's end, more trucks than the entire German military possessed of all types combined across all theatres of operation. The trucks featured numerous innovations that Germans had not implemented as standard equipment. All-wheel drive came as standard equipment rather than as an exceptional feature. Automatic tyre inflation systems maintained proper pressure. Waterproofing allowed fording of water obstacles 30 inches deep. Engines could run reliably on low-quality fuel without requiring modification. Heating systems actually functioned properly in winter conditions, unlike German equipment. Even more stunning to German observers was the American maintenance philosophy that governed operations. Where Germans meticulously rebuilt engines according to detailed procedures, Americans simply replaced entire engine assemblies. Where Germans carefully rationed spare parts due to shortages, Americans discarded entire vehicles over relatively minor problems. Where Germans relied on master mechanics with years of training, Americans deployed thousands of competent mechanics who could perform 80% of required repairs with basic training. As the front lines moved steadily eastward, the Red Ball Express adapted with a speed that stunned German planning officers who were accustomed to requiring weeks of preparation for major logistics changes. When the original route terminating at Chartres became insufficient to meet demand, Americans created Red Ball Express extensions literally overnight. They established the White Ball Express running from Rouen to Paris. The Green Diamond route connected Cherbourg to railroad transfer points. The Red Lion route linked Bayeux to Brussels. The ABC route served Antwerp, Brussels, and Charleroi. Each new route became fully operational within 48 hours of the initial conception and planning. German staff officers required multiple weeks to plan similar operations with far less ambitious scope. The Americans simply painted new route markers, assigned available trucks, and started the convoys rolling immediately. The predominance of African-American drivers in the Red Ball Express created severe cognitive dissonance for German racial theorists whose ideology undergirded the Nazi regime. Nazi ideology explicitly declared blacks to be inferior, incapable of handling complex technical tasks, and lacking in individual initiative. Yet these same drivers were performing logistics miracles on a daily basis that German forces with their supposed racial superiority could not match or counter. The African-American soldiers participating in the operation understood the profound irony of their situation perfectly. They knew exactly what the Nazis thought of them according to racial ideology, which motivated them to drive even harder and prove those theories wrong through superior performance. Every mile they drove constituted evidence against Hitler's worldview. They were fighting racism with truck keys and defeating Nazi ideology through demonstrably superior performance under pressure. Some German prisoners of war, assigned to work as labourers loading Red Ball trucks, found their entire worldview shattered by working alongside African-American sergeants who calculated weight distributions faster than German engineers, who spoke better English than German English instructors had taught, and who treated prisoners fairly and professionally, despite everything Nazi propaganda had told them about how racial inferiors supposedly behaved. The Red Ball Express required infrastructure creation that Germans deemed impossible to accomplish under active combat conditions. American engineers built or reinforced 40 major bridges, created 15 major fuel depot installations, established 26 vehicle maintenance stations, and constructed 8 temporary cities to house drivers and support personnel. All of this construction occurred while the operation was actively running and supporting combat operations. The bridge at Mantes had been systematically destroyed by German engineers specifically to halt American logistics operations. The Wehrmacht calculated that replacement would require a minimum of 6 weeks under ideal conditions. American engineers constructed a functional temporary bridge in just 14 hours, while Red Bull convoys detoured only 8 miles on hastily bulldozed bypass roads that were constructed simultaneously. German engineers, observing American construction methods through intelligence reports, expressed amazement at the techniques employed. There were no lengthy planning meetings, no detailed blueprints prepared in advance, just immediate action based on standard procedures. Americans built infrastructure faster than Germans could destroy it, created functioning facilities that appeared seemingly overnight in French fields. One particular Red Ball Express achievement stunned German artillery officers beyond all others. The ammunition supply rates achieved exceeded their highest theoretical calculations of what was physically possible. American artillery units fired without any restriction whatsoever, a luxury that no German unit had enjoyed since 1942, when logistics began breaking down. During the reduction of Metz fortifications in September of 1944, the 10th Corps Artillery fired 100,000 rounds in a single 24-hour period. The Red Ball Express delivered every single round required plus an additional 20% surplus for future operations. German artillery defending Metz was strictly rationed to 50 rounds per gun per day maximum. The disparity was absolutely overwhelming in its impact on combat effectiveness. American guns fired continuously for hours on end, while German artillery officers calculated mentally that such bombardments required 50 truckloads of ammunition delivered per hour to sustain. The Red Ball provided that ammunition flow without any pause or shortage. The Red Ball Express consumed vehicles at rates that would have completely paralyzed any other military force in the world. By late September, mechanical attrition had reached truly staggering proportions that would have been unsustainable for German forces. Average vehicle operational life was reduced to 10,000 miles compared to the normal expectation of 30,000 miles. The daily deadline rate, meaning vehicles out of service, reached 30% of all vehicles in the operation. Engines were being replaced at a rate of 500 weekly. Tyre consumption reached 10,000 tyres weekly. The total number of vehicles completely destroyed or permanently abandoned exceeded 5,000. Yet despite these seemingly catastrophic loss rates, the operation never slowed its delivery pace. American production capacity had anticipated such losses in planning. Ships arrived weekly at French ports carrying hundreds of new trucks to replace losses. Replacement drivers received just 2 days of training before being thrown directly into active convoy operations. German calculations demonstrated that Americans were destroying more trucks on a weekly basis than the entire Wehrmacht possessed in France across all units. Yet American transport capacity continued to increase rather than decrease over time. They had achieved something Germans thought physically impossible, maintaining logistics operations faster than consumption and attrition could degrade them. French civilians living along the Red Ball route witnessed American abundance that directly contradicted years of experiencing German occupation scarcity. The psychological impact on occupied populations was immediate and profoundly influential. Red Ball Express drivers, particularly African American soldiers, frequently shared their rations with French civilians, despite regulations prohibiting such actions. At every stop, children would gather around the trucks, and drivers would distribute chocolate, cigarettes, and soap to them. The contrast with German occupation policies was stark and impossible to miss. Americans gave away casually and generously what Germans had rationed strictly and hoarded carefully. German intelligence services reported on the propaganda impact among civilian populations. French civilians now believe absolutely in ultimate American victory in this war. They cite the endless truck convoys as definitive proof of American power. French resistance activity has increased by 400% along Red Ball routes. The population that had accepted our occupation through force now actively opposes it at every opportunity. In early September of 1944, the Red Ball Express faced its greatest operational challenge since inception. Patton's Third Army had advanced so far eastward that even the Red Ball struggled to maintain previous supply delivery rates. The round-trip distance now exceeded 700 miles. Drivers were physically collapsing from exhaustion. Vehicles were literally disintegrating from the sustained operational tempo beyond their design specifications. German intelligence detected clear signs of strain in the system. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel reported on September 8 that American supply lines were showing definite signs of impending collapse. Convoy intervals had increased from the standard 5 minutes to 15 minutes between departures. Average vehicle speed had decreased noticeably. This represented the opportunity German forces had been waiting for desperately. But American adaptability surprised the Germans yet again with the speed of response. Within just 72 hours, the Red Ball Express had completely reorganized its operations. They created intermediate transfer points that cut individual driver runs to 350 miles. They implemented systematic driver rotation systems to manage fatigue. They established forward maintenance bases to reduce vehicle downtime. They doubled the total number of vehicles assigned to the operation. By September 12th, daily tonnage delivery had actually increased beyond previous levels. The crisis that should have halted Patton's advance only made the logistics system stronger and more resilient. Supplementing the Red Ball Express, Americans implemented another logistics solution that Germans deemed physically impossible to sustain. Large-scale aerial supply operations began using C-47 transport aircraft to deliver critical supplies directly to forward combat units, with each aircraft carrying approximately 3 tons of cargo. On September 16, 1944, Wehrmacht observers counted 900 separate transport flights occurring in a single day, delivering 2,700 tons by air alone. The Luftwaffe at its operational peak had managed to deliver 300 tons daily to encircled forces at Stalingrad, and that had been considered a maximum effort requiring every available resource. The Americans were using transport aircraft like trucks, flying them constantly without apparent concern. There were no worries about fighter escort requirements. There were no fuel limitations constraining operations. Americans simply assumed aircraft losses would occur and overwhelmed those losses with sheer numbers of available aircraft. The Wehrmacht could not possibly compete with this industrial arithmetic that made losses irrelevant through replacement capacity. The Red Ball Express operated under command principles that fundamentally violated German military hierarchy and decision-making structures. Junior officers routinely made operational decisions that would require field marshal approval in the Wehrmacht command structure. Sergeants commanded operations larger and more complex than German colonels typically managed. This extreme decentralization baffled German observers attempting to understand the system. American logistics operations appeared to function without any apparent central control or coordination. Every lieutenant acted with the authority of a general. Every sergeant exercised the judgment of a colonel. According to German military theory, chaos should have resulted from such lack of hierarchy. Instead, Americans achieved operational efficiency that the Wehrmacht could not match despite its rigid hierarchical structure and carefully defined chains of command. By October of 1944, advancing Allied railheads began to reduce the absolute requirements for the Red Ball Express as rail transport became available. The operation that was originally supposed to last just 10 days had continued for 82 consecutive days, delivering 412,000 tons of supplies over 122 million ton-miles of transportation. German commanders, now fighting defensive battles on their own national borders, reflected soberly on what they had witnessed over the past months. Field Marshal Model wrote in his final operational report that German forces were not defeated primarily by American tanks or aircraft, though both were formidable. They were defeated fundamentally by American trucks and the logistics system those trucks enabled. The Red Ball Express proved conclusively that in modern industrialized warfare, logistics is not merely support for strategy, but becomes strategy itself. The transition from truck to rail transport was itself a logistical marvel that impressed observers. American railroad engineers had reconstructed over 1,000 miles of destroyed French rail lines, while the Red Ball was still actively running. They laid new track faster than Germans had destroyed it during their withdrawal, frequently using captured German rail equipment and materials for the reconstruction. The final comprehensive statistics for the Red Ball Express defied every German calculation of what was logistically possible for any military force to achieve under field conditions. 82 days of continuous operation, 412,193 tons of supplies delivered, 122 million ton-miles of transportation completed, 5,958 vehicles maintained as the daily average, with peaks reaching 7,000. 23,000 total drivers employed throughout the operation. 700,000 gallons of fuel consumed daily at peak. 40,000 tons of ammunition delivered to Patton's forces alone. 15 million individual rations transported. 135,000 tons of medical supplies moved forward. Reviewing these figures while in Allied captivity after surrender, German officers admitted they had calculated American logistics capabilities based entirely on European historical precedent and experience. They had taken their own best performance, multiplied it by a factor of 3, and assumed that represented the maximum American capability. Their calculations were incorrect by a factor of 10 or more. Beyond the raw tonnage and distance statistics, the Red Ball Express achieved something far more profound and lasting. It systematically destroyed German faith in their own military superiority and doctrinal assumptions. Wehrmacht officers who had confidently dismissed Americans as soft and overly dependent on mechanical support watched those same Americans achieve logistics miracles through sheer determination combined with industrial abundance. German prisoners of war would stand in silence at prison camp fences, methodically counting the Red Ball trucks passing by outside. Some wept openly at the sight. They understood perfectly what the endless convoy represented. Not merely that Americans possessed the capability to supply their armies adequately, but that they could afford to waste more resources than Germans could produce under maximum effort. They were watching their entire worldview collapse in real time, one passing truck at a time. The Red Ball Express forced an unexpected racial reckoning within the American military establishment itself. The operation's undeniable success depended overwhelmingly on African American soldiers who remained segregated by policy, denied equal treatment in the ranks, and barred from most combat roles despite their capabilities. General Eisenhower, visiting Red Ball operations during September of 1944, witnessed this profound contradiction firsthand with his own eyes. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded the general's observations in his diary. Eisenhower stood watching colored drivers who had been continuously operating their trucks for 20 consecutive hours without rest. The general stated aloud that these men were winning the war as surely as any infantry soldier engaged in direct combat. American forces needed to fundamentally reconsider many long-standing policies and assumptions. The operational success created significant pressure for military integration that contributed materially to the desegregation of American armed forces that occurred 3 years later. African American soldiers had proved conclusively in France what they had always known to be true. Given the proper tools and genuine opportunity, they would match anyone's performance regardless of race. The Red Ball represented their combat assignment, and they won that battle decisively and without question. German racial theorists whose ideology undergirded the Nazi regime struggled desperately to explain the glaring contradiction between ideology and observed reality. SS racial science publications simply stopped making any mention whatsoever of American logistics operations. The empirical evidence was too overwhelming to deny credibly, yet too damaging to acknowledge publicly within the ideological framework. German military engineers after the war studied Red Ball Express operations intensively, seeking to understand how it functioned so effectively. The lessons learned revolutionized logistics thinking worldwide across multiple nations and military establishments. Overwhelming volume overcomes individual inefficiency through redundancy. Mechanical redundancy eliminates single-point vulnerability in systems. Decentralized execution enables operational speed impossible under centralized command. Equipment standardization multiplies overall capability exponentially. Human endurance has limits, but those limits are significantly higher than traditional military planning assumed. General Franz Halder, who had served as chief of the German General Staff earlier in the war, wrote in 1950 that the Red Ball Express proved conclusively that logistics determines strategy, not the reverse relationship assumed in traditional military thinking. Americans understood this fundamental truth intuitively. Germans learned the lesson far too late to matter. Among the 23,000 Red Ball drivers, individual stories of extraordinary heroism emerged that Germans found incomprehensible within their rigid military framework and cultural assumptions. These accounts were verified through official military records and documentation. Corporal John L. Houston drove his truck continuously for 48 hours straight, delivering ammunition to the 2nd Armoured Division at Cambrai, falling asleep at the wheel 3 separate times, but continuing operations after being revived by other drivers who prevented crashes. Private Booker T. Washington's truck caught fire from overheated brakes while transporting critical medical supplies. Instead of abandoning the vehicle as safety procedures explicitly required, he drove the burning truck 2 miles to reach a field hospital, jumping clear only as flames reached the cab. The supplies he delivered saved wounded soldiers from both American and German forces. These individual stories, multiplied thousands of times throughout the operation, revealed fundamental aspects of American military culture to observing Germans. The emphasis on individual initiative, acceptance of calculated risk-taking, and absolute mission accomplishment regardless of regulatory compliance stood in stark contrast to German military tradition. German forces attempted desperately to create their own version of the Red Ball Express in late 1944 as their situation deteriorated. Operation Grafe during the Battle of the Bulge offensive included specific plans for capture and utilization of American trucks to create a German logistics express. The attempt failed completely within days. German forces captured American trucks but lacked the support infrastructure. Within 1 week of operations, 30% of captured vehicles were deadlined and non-functional. Americans would have simply replaced such vehicles immediately. Germans attempted to repair them according to their traditional methods. That fundamental difference in operational philosophy explains the ultimate defeat, according to German officers. The winter of 1944 to 1945 provided the ultimate test of Red Ball Express capabilities and American determination. Freezing rain, heavy snow, and severe ice conditions should have stopped wheeled transport operations entirely. German military doctrine explicitly stated that wheeled logistics became physically impossible below -10 degrees Celsius. Yet the Red Ball Express continued operating throughout the worst weather. Drivers wrapped chains around tires for traction, poured alcohol in radiators to prevent freezing, and simply kept the convoys rolling forward. Average speeds dropped significantly from 35 to 15 miles per hour, but tonnage delivery continued without major interruption. German observers filed reports describing ice-covered convoys moving through blizzard conditions that had completely stopped panzer divisions from operating. The Americans had created a logistics system that functioned effectively regardless of weather conditions, terrain obstacles, or enemy action attempting to interdict it. The system was not elegant or efficient by traditional German standards of military art, but it was fundamentally unstoppable through any means available. In May of 1945, after German surrender, captured German logistics officers were required by Allied authorities to study Red Ball Express operations for historical military records. Their conclusions were unanimous and utterly devastating to German military pride and self-conception. General der Infanterie Friedrich Schulz provided a summary assessment. The Red Ball Express represents a form of warfare we never imagined was possible to sustain. Americans created what was essentially a temporary civilization involving thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, and millions of tons of supplies that existed solely to feed advancing armies, then dissolved completely when no longer operationally needed. Germans built permanent infrastructure over years of careful planning and construction. Americans created superior temporary systems in mere days through improvisation. The most insightful analysis came from General Oberst Heinz Guderian, widely recognized as the father of German armored warfare doctrine. Germans invented blitzkrieg warfare, but never successfully solved its fundamental inherent limitation, which is logistics support for rapid advances. Americans solved that problem through industrial excess that we deemed physically impossible to achieve or sustain. The Red Ball Express was not merely a supply line in traditional military terms, but rather a flowing river of material that quite literally drowned our defensive forces in the field. The Red Ball Express cost the United States approximately $100 million in 1944 currency values. This total included vehicles destroyed, fuel consumed, roads damaged, and French civilian claims for property damage. German staff officers, accustomed to managing chronic scarcity of resources, found this expenditure figure incomprehensible and wasteful. Yet American planners considered the cost remarkably cheap for results achieved. The operation directly enabled the capture of 400,000 German soldiers, the liberation of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and shortened the overall war by an estimated 6 months. Each single day of continued warfare cost America approximately $250 million in direct expenses. The Red Ball Express paid for itself completely in just 1 day of shortened conflict, making it perhaps the most cost-effective military operation of the entire war. Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, who commanded logistics operations for the entire European theatre, stated the matter plainly. American forces wore out 5,000 trucks and 23,000 men to achieve the destruction of the German army in France. In any previous war in human history, such losses would represent catastrophic attrition. In American industrial warfare, such losses constitute acceptable operational overhead costs. An unexpected consequence of the Red Ball Express emerged in its revolutionary impact on post-war civilian logistics industries. Thousands of drivers returned to America after the war with direct experience operating what had been the world's largest transportation network. These veterans founded trucking companies, designed the interstate highway systems, and created the modern American logistics industry that dominates global commerce. Companies including Yellow Freight, Roadway, and Consolidated Freightways were started by Red Ball veterans who applied military logistics principles to civilian commercial operations. They had learned in France that volume beats efficiency in many contexts, speed beats perfection in competitive environments, and if you can keep trucks rolling 24 hours continuously, you can quite literally move the entire world's commerce. Military historians universally recognize the Red Ball Express as the single most decisive logistics operation of the European theatre of operations. Without this operation, Patton's advance halts completely, Paris falls weeks later than it did, and German forces successfully establish winter defensive lines that extend the war significantly. The operation comprehensively validated American military doctrine that emphasized logistics superiority over purely tactical considerations. While German officers studied Clausewitz and classical battlefield maneuver theory, Americans studied Detroit assembly lines and railroad timetables with equal seriousness. The Red Ball Express demonstrated conclusively that in modern industrialized warfare, the ability to supply military forces determines ultimate victory more reliably than tactical brilliance on the battlefield. On September 15, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, serving as Supreme German Commander in the West, received comprehensive intelligence reports analyzing the Red Ball Express in detail. After studying these reports for several hours in complete silence, he summoned his entire staff for an emergency conference. He made a sobering announcement to the assembled officers. They faced something that lay beyond any possible military solution using available resources. The Americans had created a supply system that effectively made distance irrelevant to operations. German strategy had assumed the existence of a culminating point where advancing enemy forces would inevitably outrun their supplies and halt. That theoretical point simply did not exist in American operations. Americans had revolutionized warfare fundamentally, while German forces were still fighting the previous war using outdated assumptions. His operations officer, Oberst Hans Spädel, suggested attempting to interdict the Red Ball routes using the remaining limited Luftwaffe capability. Von Rundstedt's response revealed his complete understanding of the hopelessness of the situation. With what resources exactly shall we conduct such interdiction operations? Americans maintain 6,000 trucks in continuous operation. If German forces somehow managed to destroy 1,000 trucks, which available resources made impossible, Americans would replace those losses within 1 week through their production capacity. Effective interdiction would require destroying 200 trucks daily merely to match their replacement production. German forces did not possess 200 aircraft total across the entire Western Front for all purposes combined. Behind all the impressive statistics were human stories that revealed fundamental American national character to German observers attempting to understand their enemies. Individual drivers who had not slept for 3 consecutive days refusing relief offers because they feared their particular trucks might not successfully complete the journey under another driver. Mechanics working in freezing rain to keep convoys rolling forward without pause. Teenagers who had lied about their actual age in order to be allowed to drive trucks in combat zones. Such stories, multiplied throughout the operation and shared among soldiers, created a powerful mythology that actively demoralized German forces through contrast with their own situation. The Americans were demonstrably not soft or lacking in commitment, as years of propaganda had claimed repeatedly. American soldiers drove themselves harder than Germans drove their horses, but they did so voluntarily from internal motivation rather than from fear of punishment. This fundamental difference made Americans far more dangerous than German doctrine had led forces to understand or prepare for. The Red Ball Express became unintentional propaganda far more powerful than any planned psychological operation could achieve. German soldiers positioned anywhere near the routes could hear the convoys operating throughout every night, endless streams of motors that never stopped running. The sound itself became a devastating form of psychological warfare that undermined morale. German units began reporting hearing ghost convoys that demoralized troops as effectively as actual logistics operations. The knowledge that Americans possessed unlimited supplies, while Germans were rationing their last ammunition, created a despair that fundamentally undermined combat effectiveness and willingness to continue fighting. American psychological warfare units quickly recognized the profound impact and began deliberately broadcasting recorded truck engine sounds toward German defensive lines, even when actual convoys were not present in the area. German units dutifully reported these phantom convoys as real movements in intelligence reports, clearly demonstrating the severe psychological damage the Red Ball Express had inflicted on enemy morale and judgment. In November of 1944, with rail lines partially restored and operational, the Red Ball Express was officially discontinued as no longer necessary. But the operational methods and principles it had demonstrated revolutionized military logistics, thinking permanently across all nations. The concept of continuous high-volume supply operations that accepted waste as the price of effectiveness became standard American military doctrine going forward. The final innovation that impressed observers was the remarkable speed of dissolution when the operation ended. The massive operation involving 23,000 men, 6,000 vehicles, and hundreds of physical installations disappeared completely in just 72 hours. Troops were immediately reassigned to other duties, vehicles were redistributed to other units, and routes were returned to civilian use without delay. Germans required multiple months to create far smaller operations, and often years to properly dissolve them when no longer needed. Americans simply built what they required for immediate needs, used it intensively, discarded it without sentiment when done, and immediately built something better for the next challenge. When German generals finally surrendered in May of 1945, many specifically cited the Red Ball Express in explaining why they understood continued resistance was hopeless and futile. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel stated during his formal interrogation that once German forces understood American logistics capacity fully, they knew the war was irrevocably lost. Americans could supply advancing armies faster than German forces could possibly destroy them through combat operations. The Red Ball Express constituted a weapon against which German forces possessed no effective defense whatsoever. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, recognized among Germany's most competent senior commanders, was asked directly what aspect of American forces had most surprised him during the war. His answer was immediate and unequivocal. Not American tanks, not American aircraft, but American trucks surprised him most profoundly. The Red Ball Express demonstrated to German forces that they were fighting against America's entire society's mobilized production capacity rather than merely against soldiers in the field. The final comprehensive statistics of the Red Ball Express stand as permanent testament to American industrial warfare capabilities. Total cargo delivered was 412,193 tons. Total distance covered reached 122 million ton-miles of transportation. Trucks employed averaged 5,958 daily, with peaks of 7,000 vehicles. Drivers involved totaled 23,000 over the operation's lifespan. Operating days lasted 82 consecutive days. Fuel consumed reached 57 million gallons total. Tires worn out and replaced numbered 180,000. Vehicles completely destroyed exceeded 5,000. Total cost was $100 million. German divisions defeated through supply advantage numbered 47. Estimated days of war shortened was 180 days, or 6 months. These numbers collectively tell a story that transcended purely military operations and tactical success. They represent the precise historical moment when warfare changed forever and irrevocably, when industrial capacity became demonstrably more important than tactical brilliance, when logistics determined strategy rather than merely serving strategic goals established by commanders. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the D-Day landings, the United States Postal Service issued a special commemorative stamp honoring the Red Ball Express at a ceremony held at the National Postal Museum in Washington. The ceremony officially recognized an operation that had been overshadowed historically by dramatic combat operations, but which proved equally decisive in achieving Allied victory in Europe. Veterans who attended the ceremony spoke emotionally of their pride in an operation that proved American industrial might combined with individual determination could overcome any obstacle regardless of difficulty. They had driven through complete physical exhaustion, through constant mechanical failures, through weather conditions that stopped armored formations from operating. The veterans were predominantly black soldiers who had served in a segregated military, who faced discrimination at home, who were denied proper recognition during the war itself. But they had delivered victory at 35 miles per hour down French roads. The Red Ball Express proved conclusively that in modern warfare, logistics is not merely support for combat operations, but constitutes the main effort that determines outcomes. The operation demonstrated that industrial democracy mobilizes resources on a scale that totalitarian efficiency simply cannot match, regardless of ideology. German generals who had laughed dismissively at American logistics in August were completely silenced by November, watching 6,000 trucks delivering 12,500 tons daily across 700 miles of liberated French territory. German commanders had assumed Americans would follow European historical precedent, carefully conserve scarce resources, and advance cautiously within logistical limitations. Instead, Americans created what can only be described as a logistics tsunami that quite literally drowned German forces in Allied material abundance beyond anything previously seen. The operation's ultimate success came not from military genius or innovative tactics, but from fundamental American characteristics that Germans never understood despite years of combat experience. Industrial excess, widespread mechanical aptitude, improvisational skill at all levels, and most importantly, the initiative of individual soldiers who made independent decisions that in the Wehrmacht's rigid hierarchy would require field marshal approval before implementation. In his memoirs written after the war, General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was the primary beneficiary of Red Ball Express operations, wrote what stands as the ultimate tribute to the operation and its participants. The truck drivers of the Red Ball Express deserved as much credit for the defeat of Germany as any combat unit that fought in the field. They drove through complete exhaustion, through mechanical failures that would stop normal operations, through weather conditions that halted armoured units. Without their efforts, the Third Army does not advance. Without that advance, American forces do not achieve victory when and how they did. These were predominantly black soldiers, men who faced segregation and discrimination, who were denied recognition they deserved. But they won the war as surely as any rifleman in combat. History absolutely must record this essential truth for future generations. That fundamental truth stands as the final lasting testament to what the Red Ball Express achieved and represented. 23,000 mostly African-American drivers, operating 6,000 trucks along a one-way highway to victory, achieved what German military science had declared physically impossible under any circumstances. They supplied advancing armies faster than physics theoretically allowed, maintained operational tempo beyond normal human endurance limits, and proved conclusively that in modern industrialized warfare, the side with the most trucks will defeat the side with the best tactics and training. The German generals had laughed confidently at American logistics capabilities in August, dismissing the entire system as wasteful, undisciplined, and impossible to sustain for any length of time. 82 days later, those same generals were surrendering to Allied armies that had been supplied continuously by the Red Ball Express, finally understanding that American trucks had defeated German tanks, that industrial abundance had overwhelmed military excellence, that logistics had literally become strategy rather than merely supporting it. The Red Ball Express formally ended on November 16, 1944, but its impact echoed through military history and logistics theory permanently. It proved beyond any doubt that in the industrial age, victory belongs not to the nation with the bravest soldiers or the most brilliant generals, but to the nation that can deliver the most supplies, the fastest, across the farthest distances. The German generals who had laughed at American logistics in August of 1944 were signing unconditional surrender documents in May of 1945, utterly defeated by 23,000 men in trucks. Physical reminders remained visible across France for years after the war ended. Deep ruts worn into roads by overloaded trucks, bridges that had been hastily repaired with whatever materials were available, roadsides still littered with the hulks of abandoned vehicles too damaged to recover. But the greatest monument to the operation remains the speed of Allied victory in Europe. Every single day that the war was shortened through superior logistics saved thousands of human lives on both sides. The Red Ball Express shortened the war by an estimated 6 months, representing hundreds of thousands of lives saved. In the final analysis, the German generals who laughed at American logistics learned the hardest and most enduring lesson of modern industrialized warfare. While amateurs discuss tactics and maneuvers, professionals study and prioritize logistics, and Americans speak most eloquently through trucks and transportation capacity. The Red Ball Express was America speaking very loudly indeed through the combined roar of 6,000 engines that never stopped running day or night, carrying both democracy and destruction at 35 miles per hour down a one-way road that led inexorably to complete victory. The last word properly belongs to a German officer whose specific identity is lost to history, but whose observation was quoted by a Red Ball driver during the 1994 anniversary commemoration ceremony. Standing beside a road in Belgium, watching the seemingly endless convoy of American trucks roll past his position, the officer stated in heavily accented English to his captors a simple truth. German forces had prepared extensively for everything they could imagine. American tanks, American aircraft, American naval power. German planning never adequately prepared for American trucks and the logistics they enabled. How does any military force defeat an enemy who possesses more trucks than you have soldiers in the field? The answer to that question rolled past him at precise 5-minute intervals throughout day and night, driven by exhausted Americans who were rewriting all the established rules of warfare through practical application, one delivery at a time. The Red Ball Express had transformed logistics into strategy, transformed supply operations into victory, and transformed trucks into the single most decisive weapon of the entire European war. The German generals finally stopped laughing when they fully understood this fundamental truth, but by that point in the war, Patton was already at their gates, supplied continuously by the greatest logistics operation in military history.